So, Philip, I thought it was an excellent session. Because people are so passionate about sport, it will be when we see corruption being dealt with in sport that people, I think, around the world will know that we're making progress with this agenda. So I think it's an excellent session. I want to thank everyone for contributing. This session, which I'm going to chair, is very much the sharp end of tackling corruption, which is what are we going to do to make sure we punish the corrupt and that we deliver justice for the victims. It's about turning that information we had in the first session, the transparency, into real action that will make a difference. So I think there are three questions we're trying to answer in this session. One is, how do we track down and punish the corrupt? How do we deliver redress and return the assets to the afflicted? And crucially, how do we break the cycle, whether that's the cycle between terrorism and corruption, or poverty and corruption, or any of the other underlying causes of corruption that we've discussed today. We've got an excellent panel. We've got, again, Sarah Chase to my right, who's written extensively about this. President Ghani from Afghanistan, someone who's doing an enormous amount to deal with a country that suffered so much from corruption. And then on my far left, Eva Joly, MEP, who's got a great record of prosecuting corruption in France and advising against corruption in Norway, and so brings experience from several countries, and we'll be sharing that with us. What I'd say, just to kick things off, is, first of all, how important this part of the agenda is. The declarations are important, the commitments are important, the words matter, but actually if the words aren't followed by actions, and actions that people can see, people will feel let down. And I would say there are 5 or 6 areas where we need to make sure we're making progress. One is better coordination, because everyone has argued today you cannot tackle corruption in one country alone, and that's why the work of the international organizations and the action we're taking today to set up the International Anti-Corruption Centre here in London will make a difference, but we should be asking, what more do we need in terms of coordination? We need better information. I think one of the challenges we've found is that you can have a brilliant police force that's looking to understand financial corruption, and you have brilliant financial experts who understand financial corruption, but it's only when you put the two together that you really get the action that you need. The third area is to ask what new powers are required, either in our own countries or internationally, to deliver on this agenda. We are looking at powers such as denial of entry, stopping corrupt people coming into our country. I think I mentioned this morning unexplained wealth orders. Copying this off Singapore, we've got a great record. You reverse the burden of proof, and if people suddenly have become a lot more wealthy, they have to explain why that's happened rather than the other way round. It was mentioned this morning by the OECD, powers to protect whistleblowers. I think that is a very important area. And also we're looking at changing the law in a number of areas to make it an offence if you fail to prevent something, fail to prevent money laundering, fail to prevent tax evasion, fail to prevent fraud. And that is something that perhaps we can learn from other countries, and perhaps they can learn from what we are looking at. The fourth area I mentioned is asset recovery. Have we got the right powers? 21 countries are announcing today additional powers they're going to take. And not only the powers, have we got the correct mechanisms for coordinating asset recovery? We're announcing today this global forum for asset recovery to build on the work that was done after the Arab Spring changes, when a lot of countries came together to try and return looted assets to countries like Egypt. We want to now make that much more international. And also, are we doing enough to disbar corrupt individuals or corrupt companies from contracts? The World Bank does a lot of work on this, but I think it's another area that we should investigate in this session. It's in the communique, but I'm sure there's more that we can do. That's just by way of introduction. Some of the areas I think we need to look at. There's a lot of progress being announced today, but I think the whole theme of today's summit is to raise the bar, raise the ambition for the future, so we take action in this regard. First is going to be President Ghani. Great pleasure to welcome you here to London, and please let us know your thoughts on this and these issues.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. The first issue is transformation in the culture of the state. The fifth wave of political violence in 150 years is upon us. Corruption is an enabler to this political violence, and we need to really name the problem. Second is credibility. I'm very pleased with our type of cooperation with the IMF, because they have clear conditions, and when we comply, there's a credible system of assessment. So I'd favor the surveillance regime in naming a credible process where action is credibly measured and understood in context. But the third issue is the cycle of police investigation, prosecution, and sentencing. Here, in terms of desirability, people across the developing world are fed up. There is no obstacle to desirability from the perspective of the people. On the contrary, but the notion that there are elite deals and elite deals, corrupt elite deals, are essential to stability has to be discarded. As long as we push an unaccountable elite because of extraneous considerations on the people, you're not going to have this. So it's important to establish this. We're very pleased with the nature of cooperation that we've had with UK on a special crimes task force. But the culture of prosecution, the difference here has to be between mob rule against corruption and a rule of law-based approach. That means credible evidence and not just innuendo. In a lot of these places, the most honest get to be subject because the rules of the game favor the entrenched elite. Two other points. First, national ownership. We have to have the courage to name the problem and to have action plans that meet the test of desirability, feasibility, and credibility. If there is no national ownership and there's constant denial or blame games, we're not going to get anywhere. Second, international partnership. And here, what we are asking fundamentally is for you and all of Europe to go after drug money. UNODC is documented out of $500 billion that were earned in a decade from drug money produced in Afghanistan, roughly 480 billion have ended in Europe. There's been no prosecution for this. And we need very credible action because as long as the criminal economy, that is roughly $1.7 trillion a year, persists, the networks, the actions that we do. My very last point is sustainability. We need, in order to engage in this type of action, anti-corruption should not be a fashion that is discarded with the next set of elections or the next set of changes. We have to have the know-how, the knowledge, and the determination that we are going to stay with this. Successful efforts like that, given from England, that invented grand corruption in the 18th century, to subsequent efforts in Singapore, have roughly taken a decade. This decade is crucial. It has to be sequenced right, and it has to have the credibility. And absolutely essential to this is ministers, presidents, governors, wherever corruption leads, should be brought to justice once they are sentenced. That speaks volumes rather than just action plans or things that do not end up with credibility.
I think it's a very, very good point that in many countries this has taken a lot of time. It's often involved not just changes in the law, but changes in culture, sometimes brought about by very big events, shocking events that can change the way a country thinks about itself. Eva, let me hand over to you with your experiences of how we prosecute, how we convict, how we get results, and how we deal with the victims.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and thank you for organizing this event. Things have to change. We have been trying to fight corruption for more than 20 years. I don't count the summit that I have been invited to and that I have not attended because it is not really serious. What is prevailing in the world is impunity. We have very few prosecutions, we have very few condemnations, and this because the corruption is a crime in a closed room. You don't have witnesses. The police forces cannot use dogs to find the corrupt people. We need the money trail to find the corruption and to have people convicted. And the money is disappearing in the tax havens. And we have good examples to show that. I have been working for some years in Afghanistan. Afghanistan gets a lot of money from the international community, supposed to construct the peace and to help people. But a large part of this money ended up in flats in Dubai. When we made the inquiry into the Kabul bank, we were able to establish that more than half of the embezzled amount, $400 million, went to Dubai. We had the name of the culprits, we had the account number, but Dubai did never cooperate. And this is how the world is. The money is secretly detained in tax havens. And now we have this tremendous event of the Panama Papers, where it's not the action of the politicians, it is the action of the hackers that has given us the overview, seeing from one single lawyer firm in one single tax haven that 240,000 secret companies were set up. Half of this company, Prime Minister, half of these were set up in tax jurisdictions depending on your crown. So it would be terribly important in order to fight corruption, to have transparency, to end this secrecy. And I think we cannot hide, as we say in French, behind the little finger, saying that these are independent territories. I cannot oblige them to abide by the same rules as we now have in England. I think we have to work on this and we have to get them on board, voluntary, but really with a very strong political commitment, because this cannot go on, because this builds up inequality in the world, which is the main problem. The other problem that makes that we are living in a world of impunity is that the prosecutors nearly all over the world are not independent. They are under political influence. Even in highly developed countries, like in France, we have never been able to have independent prosecutors. And this is really not ding of a democratic country. And the last point, maybe, is that the justice system is weak in most countries. They are poor. And we need to set up now, and I think this is my message of today, is that the Panama Papers, they will show a lot of corruption. The example I can take from Iceland. After the bank crisis, Iceland set up a team, and I helped them make the inquiry into why the Icelandic banks did collapse. And they were all convicted. The only country in the world that convicted their banksters are Iceland. Their assets were confiscated. But with the Panama Papers, we found that not only the ministers of Iceland, but also people from the banks had secret accounts in the tax havens. And we need to prosecute them because we know what these people earn. And they had millions on their accounts. And the money on these accounts are corruption money. And we shall not, the time of impunity is over. We should take this example, we should prosecute them. But in order to be able to do that, you need to set up a specific team. We need, in England, maybe 300 persons to take care of the thousands of accounts that you have. In France, where the justice was decapité by the former president, we are not able to deal with this secret jurisdiction and accounts. We need to set up a special team of investigators, prosecutors, and judges, like they did in Iceland. And you see, people are tired of impunity. They are tired of seeing that the Royal Bank of Scotland get billions of public money. And what do? They are helping British citizens not to pay taxes. this cannot be understood, and we must have inquiries into who helped, and for once, they should be held accountable. The time of forgiveness is over. The intermediaries, the service providers, the banks, and the people who set up these accounts to hide should be prosecuted.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Sarah, over to you.
So you called this the sharp end, right? And I'd like to make it sharp in a slightly different way. We have been dwelling today on money that's hiding in the West, on impunity, but the way the West is enabling corruption goes way broader and way deeper than that. So let me go back to my story about Nurullah, whose brother was affronted as well as being shaken down by numerous local police officers. And what I'm going to do is elaborate a little bit on what President Ghani just said. Who was training and equipping those police officers? The United States. So I want to go directly to the implications of that little anecdote. When major Western governments are providing significant military assistance along with significant civilian assistance to governments because they are supposedly governments or certain officials within governments, because they're supposedly helping in the fight against terrorism, or because they're a requirement of stability when there are migrants leaving their countries. In fact, a lot of that type of assistance is actually counterproductive because it's reinforcing the corruption of the governments or the officials and therefore increasing the indignation of their populations, not only against those governments, but against their enabling governments in the West. And so the implications here are very difficult and significant, I think, for overseas development assistance and in particular military assistance, because I mean, it just seems to me, as this initiative moves forward, there needs to be a kind of charter, not just for accountants and lawyers and bankers. There needs to be a charter for interveners, security interveners. Almost every country in this room takes part in security interventions in some way. So the question is, how do you make governance part and parcel of these interventions, be they very small, tactical, train and equip missions where you're teaching somebody how to, shoot straight. But why are we only teaching them how to shoot straight? Why is not the integrity of the procurement chain within that military institution as important a role for the trainers and equippers as teaching the kid how to shoot straight? Afghans know how to shoot, don't they? And aspirationally, I think it needs to be even bigger. I think it needs to be, you don't get involved in a security arrangement with a country without the quality of the governance that that country delivers to its people being exactly as important as the military capabilities that you're reinforcing. Thanks.
Well, it's a very powerful point. I mean, I think I would worry if it led to a lot of disengagement, then we might end up knocking ourselves back. If every time we saw aid misused in any way in any country, we decided to cancel the entire aid program.
Not what I'm saying.
The point you're saying is the governance is vital.
Work
Absolutely.
the governance into the aid package.
Which is, and also make the aid as transparent as possible.
Correct.
Because where you publish exactly how much money is going to each school, if the money doesn't get delivered, the local people will take up.
And you build oversight mechanisms.
I think it's a really important point, and that is definitely at the sharp end. Now, we've got lots of contributors who are going to come in on this session. I hope they're here, but I've got the head of Interpol, I think, is keen to speak. We've got Foreign Minister from Switzerland. I think we have an Italian minister with particular expertise in confronting the mafia. So I'm looking for any or all of those, or anyone else who'd like to join in, if you put your hands up. Let's have the gentleman back here.
Thank you very much. David W. Rivkin, President of the International Bar Association. Lawyers have been presented here as enablers, and certainly there have been lawyers who have enabled. But it's also has to be said that without the hard work of lawyers, the investigation and prosecution of those who commit corruption would never take place. I want to mention that the organizations like the International Bar Association are deeply involved in fighting corruption in many different ways. We've worked with the OECD and the UNODC in training thousands of lawyers around the world on anti-corruption issues. Most recently, we have begun a project on judicial corruption, because unless you have a corruption-free judiciary, it's impossible to end the impunity. It's impossible to bring to justice those who need to be brought to justice. And as the global organization of lawyers and bar associations, we feel it's our duty to do so. We have completed a survey working with the Basel Institute of Governance, and we'll be issuing a report on that in a couple of weeks. I have a summary that I will leave on the table here for those who want to see it, but it points out that in addition to bribery, people are most concerned about undue influence and political interference with the judiciary. That's another form of corruption that we need to combat. And it undermines the perception of governance, because it makes people feel that justice is just for the elite, whether the affluent or those involved in government. So we will be working with, we hope, the civil society organizations and the governments here on some very practical steps to fight judicial corruption. And also hopefully looking at this charter that our service companies have signed in terms of lawyers and estate agents and accountants. I think we've got the Swiss Foreign Minister. Thank you, please.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and thank you for the invitation. I speak on behalf of the Swiss government and also the Swiss people, and I would like to address only one point: fighting illicit assets. The illicit money which is leaving the developing countries, that is $100 million per day. 100 million per day. That means that if we could use this money for humanitarian aid, development cooperation, we wouldn't have any problem for financing international cooperation, and we would be able to build schools, hospitals, alleviate suffering in the world. So we are very committed in preventing corruption, in avoiding that this money comes to us. But if the money comes to us, and it is like that still now, if this money sometimes comes to us, this is my main point, then we have to make everything to return this money to the righteous owners, to the people. And that is what the Swiss government wants to do, what we try already to do, what we do. Over the past years, the developed countries have returned $5 billion. 40% come from Switzerland. We are now trying to return 300 million to Nigeria. And in doing so, we have learned a lot. We have learned, for instance, that it is really a partnership, that is a strong political will if we want to succeed in restituting. It's very difficult. It's long procedures, very, very difficult to succeed. And we have also to know very well the condition for the restitution, that it comes to the people at the end, really. And therefore, there is a partnership to build. Second, we have to have a very good legislation, domestically and internationally. We have just adopted in Switzerland a new legislation for freezing, for confiscating, and for restituting in a single act this illicit money. And third and last, we have to be more practical for requesting countries. Therefore, we have established guidelines, the Lausanne guidelines. So I just would like to call upon all actors, all countries above all, to cooperate more for restituting more. But it is really a partnership. Thank you very much.
Have we got the Raphael Cantoni from Italy's anti-corruption? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I must apologize because I need to speak in Italian. Forgive me for speaking Italian. I am the president of the National Agency Against Corruption that is trying to prevent corruption, and for a long time I've been a public prosecutor fighting against the mafia, so I have a lot of experience in repression. And looking at what I've heard until now, the real point is trying to break the mechanisms that favor corruption, because this is something that happens between two people that work in the shadows. So it's very important to use the experience we have in fighting the mafia that enabled us, thanks to collaborators, to ensure that very important things came to light. This has been used a lot in Italy for the cases against the mafia and corruption, and thanks to a law that we adopted in 2015 and that will be applicable now also to corruption. And those that help the justice will be rewarded. And this is very important. And another important mechanism for preventing corruption is to develop the system of whistleblowers. Italy has made some progress. We have a law being discussed in Parliament, but we see new mechanism of cooperation in our public administration, and this helps the situation. Finally, we believe that some decisions we took for fighting against mafia can be used against corruption. For instance, confiscation, because in our system we have a standard that means that if somebody is guilty of certain crimes, can have his assets confiscated if he cannot to justify from where these assets come from. And this is applicable to corruption and therefore enables us to have important results in the confiscation of illegal funds. So it would be important if at the end of this summit we could also look at confiscation. Thank you.
The point about confiscation is incredibly important. Different countries have different rules. I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from each other. We're short of time, so I want to rattle through, if we can, the Secretary-General of Interpol and the Kenyan Attorney-General. Brief contributions, if you could. But from the Secretary of Interpol, it'd be very interesting to answer President Ghani's point about recovering drug money that comes out of Afghanistan and into Europe. But please, over to you.
So thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister, and thanks for inviting Interpol to this important summit, the world's largest international police organization with 190 member countries. And we've been facing, of course, a lot of these challenges as Interpol provides a platform for international law enforcement to come together, to exchange information. And quite recently, we've been gathering all the, at least from 120 member countries, the national experts on anti-corruption and asset recovery experts. I just want to highlight on three of the main challenges, and maybe I can also touch on the point President from Afghanistan made. The first point is about clarity, that officers who are dealing with corruption cases will need to know whom to contact abroad, as this is really a global issue, and how to receive guidance through a maze of national legislation to bring any of these investigations forward. And I really appreciate the points you've been made. And on the other hand, to avoid uncoordinated action in a very fragmented landscape today that makes law enforcement even more difficult. The second challenge is about speed. It was already mentioned, just with a click of a mouse, you can move money around the globe, and we need to move much faster together with the judiciary. And again, Interpol provides a platform to do that much quicker, to request, to centralize, and to exchange information, as information is the key of any of our activities and the judiciary's activities. And the final point already made today, and this is what this summit stands for, it's about leadership. Corruption fighters must perceive steadfast support from their chains of command, all the way till the conclusion of their investigations and all the way to the top. Therefore, Interpol fully endorses the vision embodied by this important summit here in London and stands ready to support the activity of the International Anti-Corruption Coordination Center. Mr. Prime Minister, you've been mentioning this morning to enhance our cooperation, to enhance information sharing, intelligence analysis, and most importantly, to take action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Of course, the International Corruption Centre won't have the power of arrest or the power of prosecution. It will be able to just bring together information and will rely on other organisations to carry out those tasks. Have we got the Kenyan Attorney General here? Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for bringing all of us to London and for the enthusiasm that you have brought to this fight against corruption. I want to make 3 very quick points from Kenya's experience as to what we need to do. First, I think we need to ensure that the legal framework is more vibrant. In many countries, there are many things we ought to be doing that we are unable to do because the legal framework doesn't provide for it. The truth is that there are best practices all over the world. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to be working more together in that regard. I think that we have placed too much faith in criminal law. I think we need to rethink that as well. We need civil remedies, attaching, tracing, seizing, recovering, and returning property. Number 2, we need internal coordination. In some countries, in many countries, anti-corruption institutions don't talk to each other as much as they ought to do. The police are doing their thing, prosecutors are doing their thing, independent anti-corruption and ethics bodies are doing their own thing. We need a complete justice chain, and we can discuss that later. Finally, Mr. Prime Minister, I think that, and this is testimony, this meeting is testimony to that, we need to enhance international cooperation. In my experience, the mutual legal assistance framework needs to be revamped. And I want to pay tribute here to the Swiss, who haven't got a very good press this morning. Kenya has worked very, very well with the Swiss. They have helped us a lot in our recovery. I want to pay tribute also to you, Prime Minister, and your government. Kenya has had a very, very good support in the work we are doing to trace and recover assets. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got Minister Huang from China who wants to make a contribution. I'm very delighted that China is signing the communique that's been agreed today, so it's going to be a communique agreed, I think, by all the participants, but welcome.
Thank you, Prime Minister David Cameron. China has always attached great importance to anti-corruption. Since the 18th CPC National Congress held in November 2012, the CPC Central Committee with Mr. Xi Jinping as Secretary General has been committed to fighting corruption whenever and wherever it occurs and tackling both high and low-ranking corruption officials, or tigers and flies, so to speak. We show zero tolerance and there are no off-limits. And our anti-corruption campaign has gained support from the general public. And China attaches importance to international cooperation as well. Since 2014, we have returned from 71 countries and regions 1,600 fugitive suspects and recovered over 6 billion yuan illicit assets. In order to strengthen international cooperation on anti-corruption, I want to make 3 suggestions. First, we should implement the political consensus. Anti-corruption has been a political consensus among the international community. Now we need to put them into practice. We should establish a cooperation framework so that the corrupt suspects will have no safe haven. Second, we should enhance multilateral cooperation. We need to give play to the role of UNCAC as well as World Bank, Interpol, and other specialized agencies. We should improve the law enforcement cooperation network, such as APEC and G20. Third, we should enhance bilateral cooperation. We should speed up the signing of extradition treaties and mutual legal assistance treaties on criminal matters. We should also actively explore the ways of joint enforcement cooperation. In this regard, we have already had some practice. And next, we will expand our cooperation with other countries so that we can create better conditions for international cooperation on anti-corruption. Thank you.
To try and make them part of the G20 consensus and to drive change in that way. Right, we're going to open it up now. I think we're going to try and break for lunch in about 8 minutes' time and then come back at 2 o'clock, so you're going to have to be fast eaters, but let's try and get some points in from the floor between now and then. Let's take the lady here.
Hi, Dr. Amy Jadasimi. My company, Ladol, runs the largest industrial free zone in Nigeria. I want to take up Dr. Chase's point about interacting with countries that are struggling with corruption and extend it to the private sector. One of the biggest issues Ladol faces, and we've been developing our free zone for 10 years, fighting against corruption every step of the way. One of the biggest issues we're facing now is multinationals still preferring to contract with illegitimate companies. This pushes legitimate companies out of the private sector. It undermines what President Buhari is doing to fight corruption, and it's one of the ways in which funds are pushed out of Nigeria in the first place. We haven't seen many multinational companies being brought to task. We haven't seen much use of the very strong UK bribery laws, so we'd like to see more of that, please.
Okay, that's a very fair point. I think we've made some progress with the enablers here today of lawyers and accountants, but I think actually more action from multinational companies and a clear set of rules there are very important. Let's take the gentleman by the window.
Thanks. I'd like to back up that and talk about business. I think business are critical actors in anti-corruption, and one of the, and I think although law enforcement and sharing between governments is obviously important, when you're talking about endemically corrupt governments, that's, government having that information isn't really going to help. It needs to be, of course, civil society, but also needs to be business as well. I go back to what Robert Lowe introduced in the 1856 Company Act in the UK, which was introduced limited companies en masse. He said it's essential that everybody knows that the greatest publicity is given to companies and the information about companies so that everybody knows who they're doing business with. And when we're talking about things like beneficial ownership, we're talking about, from a business point of view, who are you really doing business with? Yeah. And if we want to have, it's about getting the incentives right in the system and getting the framework right in the system. And if we want to have business to play a positive role, they need to know who they're doing business with. They need to know the risks of doing business with other companies. And that means making this beneficial ownership information public, but also data, so it can be combined with other data. So you can see that this person, contrary to some of these discussions about privacy, that this person actually does control this company, yes, and this company and this company. And I think if we can get business playing an active role here, and if we can get data, particularly open data around beneficial ownership, that will create a good foundation on which we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. As I've said repeatedly, the gold standard is public registers of beneficial ownership, and I think that's what we should be committing to make progress towards. In our case, obviously, we've done it. Let's take someone right from the other side. The gentleman from the parliamentary group has spoken, but his neighbour, sir.
The neighbour. Hi, I'm James Apatharai from NATO, and I thought I would have to explain why NATO is here, but Sarah...
well, I think it's a very, very pertinent point, yes.
And I'd just like to say we share the view that there's a lot of money in defense and security. We know what a pernicious effect it can have. And that's why we've put in place a program which, by the way, the United Kingdom plays a very prominent role in, called Building Integrity. And it offers to partner countries and NATO member states guidance on transparency and fighting corruption in crucial areas like budgeting, getting parliamentary oversight, like procurement, so that the equipment ends up where it's supposed to be and not in the wrong hands, which sometimes happens, and in hiring, so that you hire the competent person and not the guy you know who greases your palm. So we share the view that this is very, very important. Norway and other countries are contributing to it. 30 partners have gone through it, including Afghanistan, that is going through it right now, so they've committed.
A very powerful point. The governance arrangements for these things are absolutely vital, as Sarah was saying. Sir.
Kostinborg, Minister of Economy of Romania. So a lot of, we've talked here about a lot of enablers in investigating and prosecuting and sentencing, and I think this is great, but I think population, and it was said before by the gentleman from Cameroon, population wants also results, and sentencing is not enough. I think boosting asset recovery is critical, and cooperation through the enablers that were said today, like beneficial ownership, public knowledge of ownership, and many other tools are important. But I want to open another small avenue, and Sarah mentioned, I think alluded a little bit to it, and it's investing in prevention and in education, in anti-corruption education, because only, we work on eradicating, we're working on finding the medicine, but I think we also need to work on prevention. Thanks a lot.
How do you permanently change the culture? Very good point, sir.
Hello, my name is Abdul Qadir from Nazaha, Saudi Arabia. We want to just draw attention that education is very important for protecting integrity. In Saudi Arabia, we have a unique experience to establishing clubs, student clubs and university, making them do activities that encourage them to act in a way that they will be in the future either a governmental employee or a businessman or a security, that they will behave in a way that integrity will be part of their work. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Last couple of points, the lady over here.
Thank you so much. My name is Lindsay Marchessault. I'm with the Open Contracting Partnership, and I'm just thrilled with this session because really it's about the use of the information. That's where things really have an impact. And as the gentleman was just saying, education capacity building is going to be so important. So while we're super excited about all the commitments that have been made by all the countries towards open contracting data standards and making this public information open, beneficial ownership registries, et cetera, it's all about being able to use the methodologies to cross-reference this information. We're working with the Open Data Charter now to put together a guidance package for those who want to do this type of analysis and to try to facilitate and build those tools. And as well, of course, it's a change management process. So you need to incentivize and target the businessmen, the supply chains, the communities to be active, the journalists to be active with this information, because it's not always clear to everybody what these linkages are and how to put them together. So it's a communications campaign as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your contribution, because obviously the open procurement standards are incredibly important. Final point, gentleman at the back.
Prime Minister Cameron, on Monday your government will help promote investment in Malaysia at a conference where Prime Minister Najib Razak will be present. Prime Minister Najib oversees the 1MDB fund, which is under investigation around the world for possibly stealing billions of dollars from the Malaysian people. Is your government's role in promoting that conference on Monday consistent with this conference today? Or is there a risk that by promoting the conference on Monday, you're turning a blind eye to corruption in Malaysia?
No, look, Britain is an international trading and investing nation, and we invest and trade all over the world, but that doesn't stop us raising concerns with any country around the globe about practices that are in any way questionable. And we do that and have done that in Malaysia and elsewhere. If one's reaction to the problem of corruption is to simply say the only way of not ever dealing with a corrupt business or a corrupt country or a corrupt government or a business or a person that could be any of those things is to shrink entirely back inside your own boundaries and not provide any aid to any country, not provide any security to any country, not trade with any country, frankly, we're not going to get very far. The aim of this conference is to raise standards all over the world, accepting that there is no government that is entirely free from corruption. There is no country that is entirely free from corruption. What's different about today is that prime ministers, presidents, business leaders, NGOs, journalists and others are all actually having the courage to say, right, let's sit up here and talk about these things openly. But trading with a country doesn't mean you can't raise, or investing with a country, doesn't mean you can't raise issues of concern. And for Britain, we certainly do, and I'm sure other prime ministers and presidents here would say exactly the same thing. It's been an excellent session. Just try and sum up. I mean, I think that there's a lot of good points made about the need to update our laws. I think one of the things that's come out of today is there are quite a lot of countries that still don't actually have a law making foreign bribery illegal. And I think that is a pretty baseline point we need to get over. I think Sarah's points on governance, backed up by what the gentleman said from NATO, that where we do engage rules of governance for aid, for military assistance, for train and equipment. I think the point that the head of Interpol made about speed, in an age of instant transfers of money, of digital technology, the prosecuting authorities need to be just as fast. I think the points about confiscation, where we can learn from each other, and what the Italian minister said, I think are very, very powerful. I think in terms of what you said, Eva, about no country being left behind, if we leave behind territories or countries with poor practices or poor transparency, that is where the bad behavior will go. And so part of the point of this is to raise the bar as well as raising the ambition. I think the point has been made a lot about the quality of legal systems, the independence of judiciaries, the independence of prosecuting authorities. I think that is an absolutely vital issue. And I think I'll give the last word to my friend and colleague, President Ghani, who said this must not be a fashion. This must be sustainable. This must not be a flash in the pan. I don't want this conference to be just the start of something. I would argue, as Angel did from the OECD, British interest in this started very strongly in 2013 when we held that G8 on tax and transparency and encouraging countries to join the, for instance, extractive industries transparency initiative. And I want us to keep driving this with friends and colleagues through to the UN conference this autumn, as Secretary Kerry suggested, and beyond. And I'm very grateful for all the help and support that people have brought and the ideas that people have brought today. We're going to break for lunch for, I'm afraid, half an hour, a rapid snack, and then my colleague, the President of Colombia, is going to chair the final of the sessions on how we change the culture and permanently drive out corruption from institutions. And I hope that will give many more people the chance to intervene and make their points and put their questions. But thank you very much indeed.